The sound of splintering wood exploded through the darkness at 2:17 a.m., ripping Diane Carter from sleep like a hand yanking her from deep water. Her heart seized in her chest as her bedroom door burst open, flooding with harsh white light and voices shouting commands that tangled together into incomprehensible noise. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the raw terror coursing through her veins as shadows moved across her walls and boots thundered across her hardwood floors. This was how it ended, she thought in that frozen moment. This was how a decorated federal agent with 15 years of service died in her own home, mistaken for someone else, becoming another name people would forget by next week. But then one of the officers reached the hallway, and his flashlight beam caught something that made him stop so abruptly the man behind him nearly collided into his back. On the wall, framed in polished oak, hung the dark blue windbreaker with 3 yellow letters that changed everything. Diane's hands were shaking so violently she could barely pull them from beneath her blanket as commanded. She wore only an old Howard University t-shirt and sleep shorts, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she had since she was a child. 6 officers crowded into her small bedroom, all of them white, all of them with weapons drawn, all of them looking at her like she was a threat that needed neutralizing. She wanted to scream at them, wanted to demand explanations, but her training kicked in even through her terror. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Don't give them any reason. The mantra that every black person she knew had learned by necessity, that she'd foolishly believed her badge might exempt her from. Get out of the bed. Slowly. Hands where we can see them. The command came from a stocky officer with a thick mustache, his voice hard and professional, revealing nothing. Diane complied, her bare feet touching the cold floor, her legs barely supporting her weight. She could feel their eyes scanning her, assessing, judging. Could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down on her shoulders. This was her home. Her sanctuary. The place she came to escape the ugliness of the world she investigated daily. And these men had violated it with the casual brutality of people who believed they had every right to do so. There's been a mistake, she managed to say, her voice sounding strange and thin to her own ears. I'm a federal agent. My credentials are in the kitchen, in my bag on the counter. Sure they are, another officer muttered, young with acne scars visible even in the harsh light. Just stay quiet and cooperate. It was the dismissiveness in his tone that cut deeper than the fear. That casual assumption that she was lying, that she couldn't possibly be who she said she was. Diane had spent her entire career fighting against that assumption, proving herself again and again, working twice as hard for half the recognition. And here it was again, in her own bedroom at 2 a.m, stripping away every achievement like they meant nothing at all. The officer who had stopped in the hallway finally spoke. He was older than the others, maybe late 40s, with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much. Jenkins, check that jacket. He gestured toward the hallway with his chin, never lowering his weapon, never taking his eyes off Diane. It could be anyone's jacket, Sergeant, Jenkins replied, the one with the mustache. Could have stolen it. Check it anyway. The silence that followed was suffocating. Diane stood there, half-naked and terrified in her own home, while strange men rifled through her possessions looking for evidence of her right to exist in this space. She could hear them in her living room, opening drawers, moving furniture. Could hear someone in her kitchen, probably finding the bag she'd mentioned, her credentials displayed in their official leather case. She wondered what they'd been looking for. What terrible crime had warranted this invasion? Whether they'd found whatever it was or if they'd simply decided her home looked suspicious enough to deserve destruction. A younger officer emerged from the hallway holding the FBI jacket gingerly, like it might explode. Behind him came another carrying her credentials case, open to display her badge and identification card. Both men's faces had changed, uncertainty replacing the hard certainty they'd entered with. The sergeant took the credentials, studied them carefully under his flashlight, then looked up at Diane with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite apologetic. Not quite defiant. Something uncomfortable that lived between the two. Special Agent Diane Carter, he read aloud, and suddenly the energy in the room shifted. Weapons began lowering, though not all the way. Postures relaxed, though tensions remained. The men exchanged glances, silent conversations happening in the spaces between them. Diane stood perfectly still, waiting, her heart still hammering, her mind racing through protocols and procedures and the knowledge that none of them would matter if these men decided they didn't want them to matter. "We received a call about a disturbance at this address," the sergeant finally said, his tone shifting towards something that might have been professional courtesy if it wasn't so obviously forced. "Reports of possible drug activity." "At this address specifically?" Diane's voice was steadier now, anger beginning to burn through the fear. "You're sure about that?" The sergeant's jaw tightened. "We responded to the call we received." "And you decided a no-knock warrant was appropriate based on what evidence exactly?" She watched his face, saw the answer before he spoke it. There had been no warrant. This had been a decision made in a moment, based on assumptions about who lived in this neighborhood, in this modest house on the edge of a community that had been gentrifying for the past 5 years. A decision about who deserved the courtesy of a knock and who deserved to have their door destroyed. "Ma'am, if you want to file a complaint, there's a process for that." The sergeant handed her credentials back to her, but his eyes had gone cold again. The brief moment of uncertainty had passed, replaced by defensiveness and the institutional closing of ranks she knew too well. "We were acting on information received." "Information from who?" Diane pressed, but she already knew she wouldn't get an answer. "Not tonight." Not from these men who were already backing toward her shattered doorway, already constructing the narrative they'd tell their lieutenant, already deciding that this was just an unfortunate misunderstanding and not a violation of her constitutional rights, her dignity, her fundamental sense of safety in her own home. They filed out one by one, boots crunching over splinters of her doorframe, leaving her standing in her bedroom still wearing nothing but a t-shirt and shorts. The last one out was the young officer with acne scars, the one who'd told her to stay quiet. He paused at her bedroom door, opened his mouth like he might apologize, then seemed to think better of it and left without a word. Diane listened to them descend her front steps, heard car doors slamming, engines starting, vehicles pulling away into the night. Heard them leave her with the wreckage of her home and the knowledge that she would never feel safe in it again. She stood frozen for what might have been seconds or hours, unable to process what had just happened. Then her legs gave out and she sank onto her bed, her whole body trembling with an adrenaline crash that left her feeling hollowed out and ancient. This was what it felt like, she realized. This was what her mother had tried to protect her from, what her father had warned her about, what she'd witnessed in case files and testimonies but never fully understood until this moment. This was what it meant to be seen as guilty until proven innocent, to have your humanity questioned before you were even fully awake, to realize that all your achievements and credentials and years of service could be dismissed in an instant by men who looked at your face and decided they knew everything they needed to know. Diane Carter had joined the FBI 15 years ago believing she could make a difference. She'd specialized in civil rights violations, built a reputation for thorough investigations and successful prosecutions, earned the respect of colleagues and the resentment of corrupt departments that saw her as a threat. She'd investigated cases just like this one, had sat across from victims who described the trauma of having their homes invaded, their dignity stripped, their sense of safety shattered. She documented their statements with compassion and professional detachment, had built cases against the officers who'd violated their rights. But she'd never fully understood. Not really. Not until she was the one standing in her bedroom wondering if she was about to die because someone had decided she looked suspicious. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when she finally moved, her body stiff and cold. She found a pair of sweatpants and pulled them on, then walked through her home surveying the damage. They'd been thorough, she'd give them that. Couch cushions tossed aside, kitchen cabinets left open, her office files scattered across the floor. They hadn't found any drugs because there were no drugs to find, but they'd made sure to check everywhere. Had made sure she knew they could go anywhere they wanted, touch anything they chose, violate any boundary they deemed necessary. The message was clear. Your badge means nothing here. Your credentials are just paper. You're still just another black woman in a neighborhood we don't think you belong in. Her front door hung crooked on its hinges, the frame splintered where the battering ram had connected. Cold November air poured through the gap, carrying the smell of coming rain. Diane found a blanket and tried to tack it over the opening, but her hands were shaking too badly to manage it. She gave up, sank onto her violated couch, and did something she hadn't done since her father's funeral 7 years ago. She cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from